For a brief and very strange stretch of time, the Punjabi prison match looked like one of the boldest specialty concepts World Wrestling Entertainment had ever introduced. It was not subtle, it was not elegant, it was a giant, double-walled bamboo structure with tiny escape doors, climbing restrictions, and a design so unusual that it immediately stood apart from every cage, cell, and chamber the company had ever presented. Even by the standards of a business built on spectacle, this thing looked bizarre. And that is exactly why it still has a reputation as perhaps the weirdest match the company ever put on television. The idea behind the Punjabi prison match was simple in one sense and strangely complicated in another. Two wrestlers were trapped inside a pair of connected bamboo cages. To win, a competitor had to escape both structures. On paper, that gave the match a unique identity. It was not just about surviving a cage, it was about navigating a trap. The problem was that the layout, the rules, and the pacing made the stipulation feel more awkward than exciting. A match can be unusual and still work, but in this case, the very design of the match often seemed to fight against the action instead of helping it. That is the key to understanding why the Punjabi prison match became such an odd chapter in company history. It was created as a character-driven attraction, closely tied to the great Kali and the imagery surrounding him. From the start, it was not presented as a universal stipulation that could fit any rivalry. It was built as a special environment with a specific cultural branding and a specific visual identity. That gave it instant novelty, but it also made it much harder to use outside a narrow creative context. When a match type depends so heavily on one presentation style, one performer, or one storyline lane, its shelf life is already limited. And yet, for all its limitations, the Punjabi prison match had one thing World Wrestling Entertainment has always valued. It was impossible to ignore. Fans who saw it remembered it. The structure looked different. The name sounded different. The rules were different. In an industry where visual distinction matters, that counts for something. The company clearly believed the concept was strange enough and dramatic enough to feel like a major attraction, which is why it returned it after a long gap in 2017 for Jinder Mahal and Randy Orton. That comeback alone says a lot. The company understood that the stipulation still had curiosity value, even after years of absence. But curiosity is not the same thing as durability. The Punjabi prison match never became a true staple because it had too many built-in problems. First, it was visually memorable, but not always visually clear. The structure could make it harder for the crowd and viewers to follow the movement cleanly. Second, the rules were distinctive, but they were not as instantly intuitive as a ladder, cage, or casket match. And third, the match did not always produce the kind of dramatic flow the company usually wants from a major stipulation. A specialty match is supposed to heighten a feud. If the audience spends too much time thinking about the mechanics, the gimmick starts overshadowing the fight itself. That is why the Punjabi prison match occupies such a strange place in company history. It was not forgettable. If anything, it was too memorable in the wrong way. It became known less as a beloved classic and more as an infamous curiosity. The company's own coverage has repeatedly framed it as obscure, brutal, and unusual, which feels fitting. This was never the kind of match fans expected to see every year. It was the kind of match people brought up because it was so odd that it almost felt unreal. Its rarity tells the whole story. The company has only used the stipulation a handful of times across many years, and that alone shows it was never considered essential. Truly successful gimmick matches tend to become traditions. They become annual attractions, feud enders, or signature settings for major stars. The Punjabi prison match never reached that level. It remained a special effect concept, too unusual to normalize, too clunky to rely on, and too niche to become part of the company's permanent match vocabulary. There is also a larger point here about presentation. Over time, World Wrestling Entertainment moved toward a more controlled, family-friendly image, including a publicly stated PG-era direction. A stipulation can survive in that environment if it is visually strong and broadly useful. The Punjabi prison match was visually strong, but it was never broadly useful. It was too specialized, too cumbersome, and too dependent on its own oddity. That made it much easier for the company to leave behind the more flexible match types. So why does the Punjabi prison match still matter? Because it represents a very specific kind of company creativity. The kind that aims for unforgettable spectacle first and worries about long-term practicality later. Sometimes that approach produces classics. Sometimes it produces experiments that are remembered mostly because no one can believe they existed in the first place. The Punjabi prison match belongs firmly in the second category. It was ambitious, strange, and visually unique, but it never felt smooth enough or meaningful enough to outgrow its own weirdness. And in the end, that is the real story. The Punjabi prison match may be World Wrestling Entertainment's weirdest match ever because it was built almost entirely on novelty. It looked unforgettable, sounded exotic, and promised something fans had never seen before. But once the novelty wore off, what remained was a stipulation too awkward to become iconic and too specialized to become permanent. That is why it never truly took root, and that is why it still lives on as one of the strangest gimmicks the company ever tried.